Welcome. I'm Mr. Abbott, and today I'm going to be talking about the narrative basics of your story. And really, this is going to be about how are you going to tell your story. There's quite a few choices you need to make before you even start writing. Some of you just make these on the fly, but you can actually think about them before you start writing. And so, one of the first things that I'm going to need to define here is who is the narrator? And the narrator is the person, creature, or entity that's voicing the story. Now, sometimes it's not always clear who or what the narrator is, and in that case, it's just going to be considered an entity. It's some like nameless form, almost like God narrating the story, right? Oftentimes, this is just the author, but it's not always clear who's narrating the story. From time to time, you'll have a good idea of who specifically is telling the story, but not always. And one other note I want you to make is the narrator and the author are not always the same. They're quite often different people with different objectives. Okay, and so looking at some of the vocabulary we have in this lesson, you should understand these terms by the end of this slideshow and presentation. You want to know what the narrator is. You want to know what the point of view of the story is. You're also going to want to know what a first person, second person, and third person narration is. And you want to know the difference between third person limited and third person omniscient narration. The terms in media res, present tense, past tense, chronological, epistolary narrative, frame narrative, breaking the fourth wall, and unreliable narrator are all terms that will help you understand your writing and the choices you're making in your writing better. And so moving on, let's look at some of these things that I'm mentioning here. One of the first things that you're going to have to decide when you're writing your narrative is what is the point of view going to be? And the narrator can have several different perspectives in the story. They can have what's called first person, second person, or third person. And third person can be limited or omniscient, which I'll explain in a minute. Now, first person narration is a style of where the narrator is, you're seeing from the narrator's eyes. You're seeing from the narrator's point of view. And so you only know and you can only see what that character knows. And typically in first person narration, it uses the words like I and we. And you'll see this occasionally in movies. Movies tend to prefer third person point of view, but occasionally you get a movie like this clip from Cloverfield, which is a first person point of view. So let's take a look at what this looks like.
Man, what is going on? Maybe you should have left town a little bit earlier, right? Shut up. Oh, shit. Go, 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 go!
Okay, and so you get the general idea. We're seeing through this person's eyes, or in the case of the Cloverfield, through the camera. And so we really only know what that character knows. And often that will limit what we understand and what we see. And we have to walk the story through that person's point of view because we aren't getting any other forms of knowledge besides that first person or that one narrator's point of view. And so here's some examples. The Great Gatsby is written in the first person. He says, in my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice I've been turning over in my mind ever since. You see the my and the I. Those are all signs of the first person. All this happened more or less. The war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. One guy I knew was shot in Dresden for taking a teapot that wasn't his. Another guy I knew really did threaten to have his personal enemies killed by hired gunmen after the war, and so on. I've changed all the names. And that's from Slaughterhouse-Five. And once again, you see the I telling the story. When I wake up on the other side, When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. My fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth, but finding only the rough canvas cover of the mattress. She must have had bad dreams and climbed in with our mother. Of course she did. This is the day of the reaping. Here we have the Hunger Games, and Katniss is the very famous first person narrator from that story. We're seeing everything from her point of view and living out those Hunger Games from her point of view. And so, when should you use first person narration? This is usually a pretty good starting way to write your narratives. It's really beneficial when you have one character that you really want the reader to know and understand. You want them to understand their story from their point of view, right? You only want the reader to know or see the world from that one person's point of view. So maybe there's some kind of mystery that they're trying to figure out, and the mystery will be ruined if you give other people's points of view. And typically, you want to you'll do this if you want to show a specific lens that you want your reader to see through. So maybe you want your reader to view the story in a certain way that's only capable through this character's point of view. And this would be another really good use of first person narration. Now, this next type, second person, is very rare, but it's coming up more and more often. And it's a second person narration, and the narrator is telling you what you are doing. And so in the second person narration, the reader is forced to be the main character. They're immediately put into the perspective of that character. So the narrator will frequently use the pronoun you. And so it's like the narrator's pointing at you and telling you what you're doing. It can be very weird because, well, I'm not doing that. But it is a very rare point of view, but it exists. And one of my favorite short stories, this Nine Curves River by R.F. Kuang, uses this point of view. And so I'm going to play a little bit of this for you as soon as I get this lined up.
You've never been to Arlong before? The farthest you've wandered from our home on Owl Island is the local water market, over the canal intersection that links together the archipelago where we live. You've never come with me and Baba to Arlong, the provincial capital, on our yearly trips to trade bone carvings and dried salted mayo for silks, knives, and new wire for hooks. Mama and Baba have never let you. They've always wanted to keep you safe from the capital. Owl Island is a tiny and familiar domain, but Arlong is a rich, greedy, dense, and devouring city.
Okay, and so forgive the translation errors here on the text, but it's not quite what it should be. Is really having a really hard time finding a digital copy of this version of this book. But what you might notice is that the narrator keeps telling you what you're doing. You, and it can make you feel like, okay, I'm that person. Lead me through the story. Tell me what happens. But it's not a very common narration form. And then finally is the third person narration. And this is where you're kind of sitting. This is most like sitting and watching TV. The narrator is a person or an entity just telling the story that you're not really part of. You're just watching the story happen. There's definitely a level of distance between you and the story when it's third person, right? And so the reader views the story as a bit of an outsider, and the narrator will use he, she, and it to refer to the characters in the story. You may follow one character, but you don't really see the world through their eyes. Everything is kind of reported back to you through another source. Now, there are two types of third person narration. One is limited, and limited means that you're only getting the point of view of one character. You don't know everything that's going on, and the narrator might not know everything that's going on. And so the narrator is really restricting what you as the reader gets. And then there's the omniscient narrator, and this narrator knows everything about everyone, right? And they could tell you everything that happened in the world, everything that's going on right now. It's just a matter of time before they tell you everything. The narrator knows it all. And so it's much harder to write from the omniscient point of view because you have to really kind of have a good grasp of everything that's happening in the story. But when the omniscient third person narrator happens, it's like you're like an entity that's ruling over the story, and you're going to kind of give information as you need to give it. And so here are some examples of third person. One's from the Wizard of Earthsea. He was born in a lonely village called Ten Alders, high on the mountain at the head of the Northward Vale. You see, he is how they're referring to the protagonist of the story. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of Number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. It's Harry Potter, third person. In the week before our departure to Arrakis, when all the final scurrying about had reached a nearly unbearable frenzy, an old crone came to visit the mother of the boy, Paul. And that's from the book Dune. And here they're referring to the narrator, the main character, the protagonist, Paul, by his name, not as I. If this were first person, it would be that the old crone came to visit my mother, right? And so it just changes the distance between the reader and the character when you choose these things. And so when you choose the third person narration, you're writing a story that wants to follow many different characters and perspectives. The story doesn't need to be limited to the knowledge or experience of one person. And you might want the reader to experience the story as more of a spectator than a participant. And so it really, if you choose first person or third person, I really don't think you're going to go wrong. Second person would really be an advanced writing type that would be much harder to master. And so one of the issues I'm going to tell you is that your story is two tenses, right? And so typically in narratives, the author chooses one of two verb tenses to write in. It's the present tense or the past tense. And once you've chosen, it's that for the entire story. And you're going to hear me say this with some of your narratives, is that you switched tenses. You switched from the present tense to the past tense. So let's take a look at what that means. And so here's an example of the present tense versus past tense, right? I walk down the street looking for the lost dog is the present tense, whereas the past tense would be I walked down the street looking for the lost dog. Present tense would be I can smell the sweet scent of kettle corn. Past tense was be I could smell the sweet scent of kettle corn. Present tense would be I've been lost before, but this is a new level of lost. Past tense is I had been lost before, but this was a new level. So it's a very slight difference, but it makes a big difference in your story. And so the past tense is you are really kind of telling things that happened already, right? Whereas the present tense is happening now. You're walking your reader through the story that's happening now. But your narrative should be entirely in the present or the past tense, but not both, right? So here are two ways to do this incorrect, right? If you say he walked into the kitchen and sees his dad, right? Walked is in the past tense, whereas sees is in the present tense. If it were past tense, it would be saw, right? Or you could do it this way. He walks into the kitchen and saw his dad. Right? These are you're mixing up your verb tenses, and you really don't want to do this in your story. So either of these could be correct. He walked into the kitchen and saw his dad, or he walks into the kitchen and sees his dad. And the past tense of see is saw, not seen. Please don't write he walked into the kitchen and seen his dad. If you want to know the difference between when to use seen, let me know. I will explain it to you. But you notice in this sentence, both of these verbs are in the past tense. In this sentence, both of these are in the present tense. You choose a verb and you stick to it, right? You don't want to mix and match. Now, that being said, there are some exceptions where you will have to do this. Dialogue is always in the present tense. So even if you're writing in the past tense, your dialogue is going to be the present tense. Because when dialogue is happening, the character is speaking as though things were happening right then, right? And so somebody might say, I am so hungry, he said, right? Am is a present tense first, but the said is past tense. And occasionally in present tense narratives, a character will refer to the past. So if you're writing in the present tense and your character talks about something that happened before, that might happen. So you might say, I once got bit by a dog in this park, so I keep my eyes open every time I walk through it, right? And so here, got is referring to something, the character is narrating something that happened in the past. So that might happen occasionally, but typically there's some kind of time word in the sentence, like once, that clues in the reader that the narrator is going to stop talking about the present tense and talk about the past. All right, and so which tense should you use? It's really up to you. I can say that the present tense is really good for if the action's happening and the future is uncertain, right? You don't want your reader to know whether or not things turn out okay. It's happening right in the middle of things. It makes your reader feel uneasy because they don't know really what's going on. It makes the events seem more immediate because you're right in the middle of things. It's not a story that happened and is concluded. You're right in the middle of it. And the present tense is going to be a little bit more advanced than the past tense. I'm not going to lie to you. It's harder to do the present tense right. You need a little bit more experience to do the present tense well. I'm not saying don't do it if you really want to do it, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult for beginning writers. So the past tense, the story is over, and the narrator is telling the audience something that happened. And so you have like this old man sitting down and telling about his past, or somebody may like, let me tell you what happened to me yesterday. The story is done, and because of this, there's oftentimes when you tell a story in the past tense, this feeling that everything is going to be okay. I mean, after all, somebody's left alive to tell the story, so it couldn't have gone all bad. The narrator is going to survive. We know because they're in the future telling us the story of the past. So, when you write in the past tense, there's never really that big worry, especially if it's first person, that the narrator is going to come to some serious harm because they're still there to tell the story. But this is a little bit more of a traditional storytelling voice, and you're going to find the vast majority of stories are written in the past tense. But it's probably more recommended if you're a beginning writer to write that story that already happened rather than one that's happening immediately. Okay, and so let's say you've made your choice of what point of view you want to take and what tense you want to write in. There's a couple more choices that you may want to consider before you even start writing a word, right? So there's a couple stories, a question about the narrator, about how do they really feel about the story? Do they break the fourth wall and are they reliable? And as far as structuring your story, what is the chronology? Is it an epistolary story? Is it a frame narrative? Is it in media res? And I'll explain all those in a minute. But these are all things that you want to consider right before you write your story, because these are going to change how you tell the story. And so, how the narrator feels about the story will be one of the first choices you make, because if your narrator's not taking the story seriously, or if they're angry about something, that will change the way that they tell the story. Now, one of the choices you might make for your narrator is that they will do something called breaking the fourth wall. And this is when the narrator stops the story. All the action in the story stops. The narrator turns to the reader, reminds the reader that they're not in the movie, right? It pulls the reader out of the book, or it pulls the reader out of watching the movie and reminds them, yes, you are in fact just watching a movie. You're not living this story. And it can be either comedic or traumatic. And here I have an opening scene from a movie called Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and see if you can spot the point where Ferris Bueller breaks the fourth wall.
Ferris? Tom!
What's the matter?
Oh, it's Ferris.
What? What's wrong?
What's wrong? For Christ's sake, look at him, honey.
Ferris?
He doesn't have a fever, but he says his stomach hurts and he's seeing spots.
What's the matter, Ferris?
Papa?
Honey, feel his hands. They're cold and clammy.
I'm fine. I get it.
No!
I have a test today.
No.
I have to take it. I want to go to a good college so I can have a fruitful life.
Honey, you're not going to school like this now.
Oh, fine. What's this? What's his problem?
He doesn't feel well.
Yeah, right. Dry that one out, you can fertilize the lawn.
Jeannie? Is that you? Jeannie? I can't see that far. Jeannie? Jeannie,
Bite the big one, Junior.
Thank you, Jeannie. You get to school.
Wait, you letting him stay home? I can't believe this. If I was bleeding out my eyes, you guys would make me go to school. This is so unfair.
Jeannie, please don't be upset with me. You have your health. Be thankful. Oh.
That's it. I want out of this family.
I'm okay. I'll just sleep. Maybe I'll have an aspirin around noon.
Now listen, I'm showing some houses to that family from Vermont today, so I'll be in the area now. My office will know just where I am if you need me, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
I'll check on you too, pal.
It's nice to know that I have such loving, caring parents. You're both very special people.
Now you get better, Pumpkin.
Okay, Pumpkin.
I'll be home at 6 sharp. If you need anything, call.
Ringy dingy.
We love you, sweetie.
And then me.
Call if you need us.
They bought it.
All right, you might notice that when he turns to the camera and talks to the audience, he says, they bought it. That is immediately breaking the fourth wall. And what the fourth wall refers to is it goes back to plays. And if you think of a stage has 3 walls. And where would the fourth wall be? It'd be the wall between the audience and the actors up on the stage. And when you break the fourth wall, it's because you're going through and you're reaching the audience. And this can be a choice that you make in your narrative. You'll see this a lot in Deadpool. Deadpool does this a lot, where he stops the action and just starts talking to the audience. And it typically makes the story a little bit more of a joke. Although sometimes, if you're watching something pretty intense, they will break the fourth wall to be like, "What are you going to do about it? Like, you're part of this," and it can be pretty traumatic for the viewer. When they do it that way. But typically this is used for comedy. So this is one of the questions you want to ask yourself. Is your narrator going to break the fourth wall to stop and explain things to the reader? Another thing you may want to consider is your unreliable narrator. And you have to ask yourself, your narrator doesn't have to be this ultra pure person who tells the truth and makes sure that the story is represented in the way that it should be represented. And so you want to ask yourself, are they a credible person who's going to tell the story in a way that's in line with what actually happened? They might be unreliable if they are openly or secretly insane, if they're biased towards one thing or another, if they're out for vengeance somehow and they're trying to ruin somebody else by telling this story, or if they're just blinded by their own prejudice or feelings. And so, you can think about the unreliable narrator if you have a sibling and you've ever heard them tell a story that purposely made you seem like you did something worse than what you actually did, because they're trying to change the story to make it more favorable towards them. They're being an unreliable narrator. And this happens in books. Sometimes the narrator in the book is lying to the reader, and you start to realize that as you read the book that, hey, this narrator is not leveling. Something is happening here. And now, one last thing you want to consider is just how you're going to organize your narrative. The first question is, are you going to tell it in chronological order or in achronological order? And that just means, are you going to tell things in the order that they happen? So chronological is 2 parts. It's chronos and logical. Chronos means time, and logical. And so does the order of time make sense? Right, and so chronological order just tells the story in the events that in the order that they happened, right? And you don't have to tell a story that way. You can start in the future and then jump back. That's something you consider when you're writing your narrative. An epistolary narrative, and now this is a story that consists of letters or documents. If you ever watched the show or read the book 13 Reasons Why, I believe that one is a series of recorded tapes. Right, and so everything that's happening in the story is just the tape playing and explaining why the narrator chose what she chose. Right, it could be just a series of letters back and forth between 2 people. This is a narrative, and this is a way that you can write your story. You can choose what's called a framed narrative. And so this tends to happen when the story is in a different location and time than at the beginning and the end of the narrative. So one of the examples of this is a story by Haruki Murakami, where he tells the story of what's called the Seventh Man. And it starts off with a bunch of people sitting in a room telling their story. They're sitting in a circle and they're all sharing their stories on a stormy night, right? And then there's this flashback into the whole story of this man, and it goes through the whole story, and then at the end it goes back to that room. And this is what's called a frame narrative. And so typically what tends to happen with a frame narrative is it starts in the future, goes to the past, tells the story of the past, then jumps back to the future. So it's the narrative is framed, it's like bookended with two different like it's bookended with a different time and place at the beginning and the end. And then the last thing you may consider is you may start your story in media res, which is Latin for just in the middle of things. And so you've seen this. If you ever, the story starts and you get no introduction to the characters, no introduction to the setting, something is happening. You're like, what is happening? What's going on? You're right in the middle of the action. And so the story starts in the best part of the action. It starts when it's really exciting. And then the reader is just gradually shown how the character got there through flashbacks or dialogue or something like that. And this is a really good way to get people's attention, get them really interested in the story right away. And all of these can be used in different ways to get your reader's attention, but they're all things you want to consider before you start your narrative. And so if we look at some of the vocabulary, hopefully you know these terms by now. And if you don't, I would strongly recommend going back and reviewing some of the things I talked about. And if you need to, watching additional videos or getting additional help on these topics. So you should know what a narrator is. You should be familiar with the point of view and the three types, first, second, and third. You should know what an en media res story is. You should be familiar with the difference between present and past tense and what it looks like when you're writing in it. You should know what a chronological narrative is versus an achronological. An epistolary narrative, that's a series of recorded tapes or letters or documents or anything like that. A framed narrative, breaking the fourth wall, which you're very familiar with if you've ever seen Deadpool, and the unreliable narrator. And these are all things that you want to consider whether or not before you want to use them in your narrative before you even started. These are the things that are going to take your narrative past just a basic story that's being told into something that you are crafting and making choices on. Because when you're writing stories, you want to make sure that you are making the choices that are most effective for the story that you want to tell. Good luck on your second narrative. And when you start it, I want you to consider all of these things beforehand. Let's take a look at your upcoming assignment. All right, hello everybody, and I'm here looking at my narrative. You're going to need to get the narrative that you wrote out in order to do this assignment. So I have my rough draft of my narrative, which you can see here. I still need some work. It's not quite finished, but I can still do this assignment because this whole assignment revolves around being able to identify the choices that you made in your narrative in order to tell your story. And so at the top of my narrative, in the right top left-hand corner, I've written three things: point of view, tense, and narrative choices. And what I want you to do for this is I just want you to identify what choices you made to tell this story, right? And so I'm going to put here under point of view, I'm going to type first, capitalize the one because that makes an exclamation point. First person. I'm just identifying what I did in this story. And if you were to scroll down here, you'd see that I is the word. And so I made the choice to write this story in first person. I want you to identify what point of view your story is told from. I want these pieces of information up in the top right-hand corner so we can refer to them when you go to workshop your paper, and I can tell what it is you intended to do, whether or not it's what you ended up with. Next is tense. And so are you writing in present or past tense? And so here you can see was permanent, hoped, would, faced. I've written this story in past. And so some of you might have mixed tenses, and that's something that you want to identify. But I will definitely be able to identify if you're not writing in the correct tense if you put it up in the top. And then finally, let me know about those narrative choices, right? What is it? What narrative choices is it that you have made here? And so I know this story is going to end up being a framed narrative. And it is a chronological. I start at the end of the story and then pick up at the end of the story. I don't start at the beginning of the story. And so this is pretty simple. It's pretty easy assignment. I just want you to use what you learned here. And I'm going to be looking for this little piece of information in the top left-hand corner of your narrative. Tell me, what is the point of view of your narrative? What is the tense you chose to write in? And what narrative choices that we talked about in the video did you make? And I will be checking this when I go to workshop your assignment. I expect to see this information in the top right-hand corner of your narrative. Thank you, and of course, let me know if you have any questions on this assignment.